Paul, can you give us an update for IndianCountryTV.com and Native News Update on the John Graham trial?
Yeah, well, it's blistery weather out here in Rapid City, South Dakota, and I suspect this was the same time of the year that members of the American Indian movement brought Annie Mae Pictou Aquash to Rapid City, South Dakota to be interrogated, and sometime during the next 24 hours, 35 some years ago, she was executed. So far, this trial started on Monday with jury selection that lasted 2 days. Opening statements were done on December 1st, with both the prosecution opening up and the defense opening up their statements. And essentially, I think the prosecution has outlined the case as most people pretty much know it from the Arlo Looking Cloud trial, the Dick Marshall trial, and the guilty plea of Thelma Rios just here a couple of weeks ago. And that is that members of the American Indian movement, at the direction of the leadership in AIM, came to believe that Annie Mae Pictou Aquash may be a government informant. She was then picked up in Denver, Colorado at the home of Troy Lynn Yellowwood, Troy Lynn Williams, Troy Lynn Yellowwood, and was tied up down there. Now, there's some significance to that because we'll jump back to a little bit of this. Thelma Rios, a couple of weeks ago, pled guilty to being an accessory to kidnapping, which ended up in a murder. She pled guilty to that. She had served 90 days. She's on probation for 5 years, and she will be available for testimony. But essentially, the most important thing that Thelma Rios said, Kim, was that she made the phone call on behalf of leadership members of the American Indian movement, and she called Angie Begay, who is now known as Angie Janice, in Denver, Colorado. Angie Begay, in 1975, was living with John Boy Patton Graham. They were a partner, and Angie Begay had a daughter by Dennis Banks. So there was a connection with AIM and Dennis Banks in this whole scenario as well. Rios hasn't testified, and it may be that she may not have to, because basically Angie Begay says, I got the phone call from Thelma Rios directing us, members of the American Indian movement, to relay the message that Annie Mae needed to be brought back to Rapid City, South Dakota. Annie Mae then was taken into custody at Troy Lynn Yellowwood's home in Denver, Colorado, and that's where Angie Begay, during her testimony, said she did see Annie Mae tied up as they escorted her to the car that left for Rapid City, South Dakota. Troy Lynn Yellowwood gave more firmer testimony than ever before. She said on the stand that she hadn't been completely truthful because she was trying to protect Arlo Looking Cloud. It may be that with the Rios guilty plea that Troy Lynn is actually beginning to look at the possibility that she could be charged with perjury, and therefore she admitted that Annie Mae Aquash left Denver, Colorado against her will. She didn't want to go, but basically said that Annie Mae still at the very last moment says, look, don't worry about it, I'll just go. A third person testified by the name of George Palfy. Him and his wife were there, Angie, and George was there. He testified and actually corroborated then this whole scenario, that Annie Mae was kidnapped. She was taken against her will by Arlo Looking Cloud, Theda Nelson Clark, and John Boy Patton Graham. And he actually testified that was a third individual, Ida Williams, which would be Theda Nelson Clark's either, I believe, if she's a sister or another niece, because this is a kind of in a family affair as well. Palfy said that he saw Annie Mae tied up as well in Denver, Colorado. So that seems to be a fairly clear fact in this scenario.
And that was the testimony from December 2nd?
That testimony is from just on December 2nd. Yes, those individuals. Palfy, people have said that. I wasn't there. People said that Palfy came across as a very credible witness in the situation expressed a great deal of remorse for not having done more in 1975-76 when he began to realize that there's a connection between what happened there and the fact that he found her later on. But everyone was saying that it had to have been something else, that the timeline wasn't right, that she was alive. So George simply said that he felt like he should have done more. But out of that comes that scenario that you have the three principal people, and that is Arlo Looking Cloud, who's already been convicted of first-degree murder. He's serving a life sentence, who will probably testify next week that they took Annie Mae in custody, that she was tied up by Theda Nelson Clark, put in a car, and brought back to Rapid City, South Dakota, not as a cooperating witness or an individual, but someone who was reluctantly and actually needed to be tied up in Denver, Colorado. That's kidnapping. So I believe the feds and the state have established that there was a kidnapping between the Rios guilty plea and the testimony that she gave to prosecutors at that time and what we got out of the witnesses. I don't think there's going to be any denying that that's what's taken place. And that may be significant to this case because while Attorney Murphy, on behalf of John Graham, hammers away at the prosecution witnesses, essentially what he's been put on the table is no alibi or alternative theory at this point, and of course it's the prosecution witnesses. Basically what he's hammered away at is the fact that everyone has multiple testimonies and things going on, and so you're going to find a discrepancy. Some of these people testified in 1976 at a grand jury, 1984, 1992, 2001 grand juries. They made statements to police officers. They've testified in court. So Murphy's looking at every tiny little thing and says, well, this is what you said over here. This is what you didn't say over here. And all the witnesses, I think, so far have those discrepancies. But I think for the jury and myself, I'm kind of preconditioned on certain things because I've dealt with this case so long, that while you have this broad breadth of material coming in, it's beginning to get narrowed down. And people have said there's three people mainly involved with this at this point, and that's what the prosecution needs to convince the jury of. They don't need to talk about Dennis Banks and Vernon Bellcourt and Clyde Bellcourt and Russell Means and their involvement yet, because that's may yet to come in the future. What they're trying to establish is whether or not John Graham was there throughout this ordeal. He has been accused of being the trigger man, the person that shot Annie Mae at the end of this 72-hour ordeal from Denver to Rapid City to Wambley. The prosecution doesn't have to prove that he's the shooter. They have to prove that he was involved in the kidnapping, that he understood that she was in danger, or you don't tie someone up unless you're serious about things, and he participated in it. And I think they've established that. He's been charged with kidnapping and the perpetration of first-degree murder, which is the same sentence as murder, but it's basically saying, well, you kidnapped her and she ended up dead and you were involved in it and knew it. That's what the state has to prove at this trial today, and so far I think they've done it fairly well. There isn't anything that the defense has been able to throw out I think that's misled us, and that's just all on December 2nd.
And who was the witnesses today that testified?
Today the witnesses started out with Cleo Gates. That is the ex-wife of Richard Marshall. Of course, earlier this week, Judge Delaney here said that Dick Marshall must testify next week. His attorney made several pleas. In fact, his attorney's still apparently trying to work something out where Dick Marshall doesn't have to testify. But remember, Dick Marshall was acquitted of murder in the first degree earlier this spring. He's the one that provided the gun. Jury acquitted him. He said he intended to plead his Fifth Amendment if he was called. And they gave him immunity from any potential charges other than perjury. And the judge has ordered him that said that you will testify and you will be open to the charge of perjury if you lie. Because essentially, Marshall's attorney, Dana Hanna, says, look at, what they're trying to do is get a client up on the stand, and if he lies, they'll send him to jail on the third strike for the Montaloo murder charge. So Cleo Gates testified this morning that they indeed did bring that Theda Nelson Clark, John Graham, Arlo Looking Cloud, she identified along with Annie Mae, came to her house. They said that one of the individuals escorted her into their house and sat her down, that Dick Marshall and the trio, while Cleo was in the kitchen, she gave a cup of coffee to Annie Mae and gave her a donut. That while she was doing that, the trio went back into the back room and talked. Dick Marshall came out and said, they want us to keep Annie Mae in the basement of the house. They're talking about maybe tying her up and keeping her down. This is something that Cleo apparently had not testified to do because Murphy got up right away during cross and said, look, you never said anything about these guys saying, well, she says Dick Marshall says they're talking about keeping her here. They want maybe talk about tying her up if they have to. The other thing they noted is that Annie Mae didn't run. She wasn't tied up at this particular point. There was a front door, the back door. She didn't ask for help. There was a telephone. But Cleo said that Annie Mae didn't say anything. She basically offered a cup of coffee, and she said, yeah, offered some soup. She said no. But at this particular point, it appears that you're dealing with someone that's deeply terrified, because Annie Mae for about a month and a half now had been dealing with the accusations of murder, of being an informant. Excuse me. She had been at the Marlo Brando motorhome. She had witnessed the alleged Peltier confession to shooting the agents. There was people saying that she was an informant. She was under a lot of stress and anxiety. She was kidnapped. By the time they got there, Cleo basically says she's not arguing, talkative. She's not saying anything. She's just sitting there. And so it's kind of the state of the mind. So Cleo, definitely, now they put the trio at Dick Marshall's that night. The second witness of the day was Candy Hamilton, who basically talked about the issue of Aquash's interrogation at the Wickledock house. And Hamilton had talked about Annie Mae being interrogated there, who she saw, that she assumed that Bruce Ellison was there, that she heard the voices of Madonna Gilbert and Lorelei Decoria. Madonna Gilbert is Madonna Thunderhawk nowadays. Through the walls of the building there at the little Wickledock house where they brought Annie Mae. But again, Candy testified that Annie Mae was not tied up during a particular period, though she was crying and very distressed. The significant thing that Candy said, interesting enough, was that during the time period that she was involved with Wickledock as a legal advisor is that there was an attorney that expressed the desire that this case not be looked into it, and that was attorney Ken Tilson of Minneapolis, a person very close to Vernon and Clyde Bellcourt, the person who was in charge along with Vernon Bellcourt for fetting out the informants within the American Indian movement, an attorney who received the wallet of Annie Mae in 1976, February, March, and rather than giving it to federal authorities or the FBI or anyone else invested in this case, sent it back to Nova Scotia without it being examined by law enforcement officials during that time period. Ken Tilson was then the attorney for Dick Marshall in the Montaloo murder case. So that's an interesting connection that seems to be emerging as well. Throughout the day, we've heard the names Leonard Peltier several times in regards to this case now. It's not just Kamook Nichols did come on and testify, and actually the judge is preventing her from testifying about the alleged bragging incident in the Marlo Brando motorhome that was allowed into federal court. But Leonard Peltier's name has been mentioned numerous times this morning, along with Dennis Banks, Russell Means, Vernon and Clyde Bellcourt, as leaders and people who could have facilitated this thing. But again, that's not the attention of the prosecution or the jury's responsibility at this particular point. That may still be coming. So
we're just about out of time here. So they're going to continue with the trial on December 6th, and we'll catch up with you then, okay?
Okay, sounds good. Kim, that's the briefest update we can do for IndianCountryTV.com today. Thanks for having me in.
Hi, Paul. Do you want to give us some information on what's happening in the Aquash trial this week?
Kim, the trial resumed this morning on Monday, December 6th, with the resumption of the testimony of Kamook Nichols Ekafy. And basically the biggest thing that happened this morning right away was that judge reversed his own ruling last Friday, which prevented Nichols from testifying about hearing Leonard Peltier brag about shooting the agents. The judge apparently went back to his statute books and read the law and decided that Kamook could testify as to what she heard Peltier said, even though it doesn't make what Peltier said the truth of the matter, is how they ruled it. And so she did testify this morning that her sister her sister Bernie Lafferty, and Annie Mae Pictou Aquash and Dennis Banks were all present in the Marlo Brando motorhome in November of 1975 when Peltier bragged about shooting the agents. And what's significant about that in regards to the Graham's murder charges and cases is that they're attempting to show that this bragging then provided a motive for members of the American Indian movement, and including Leonard Peltier, to move against Aquash if they believed that she was a government informant. The defense attorney, Murphy, attempted throughout this morning's testimony to show that Annie Mae was being included in making bombs. She was being curried around almost 6 months from the time that Peltier first interrogated her in Farmington in 1975. For the next 6 months, Dennis Banks and Leonard worked with her, got her help build bombs, help in Marlo Brando motorhome, and basically Murphy was trying to establish, well, in that case, they must have trusted her. Kamook did testify that the reason that they had her building bombs and had her close by was to keep an eye on her and to perhaps implicate a government provocateur in the commission of a crime, which would hopefully then get Dennis Banks and Leonard Peltier off the charge if Aquash was an informant. So it's an interesting scenario. The defense also hammered away at the reimbursements that Nichols was provided for by the FBI in the year 2003 and the year 2004, a total of $42,000, which encompassed two major moves for security reasons. And Murphy kept referring to it as being paid by the FBI and more than you made during that year for income, and whether or not she claimed it for taxes and all that. She got through the majority of that, I think, through testifying that it was reimbursements for actual expenses, airline tickets at a time when she was doing wires for the FBI. After Kamook was done, you got any questions about that? For
in regards to Kamook, you said that was Dennis Banks' wife at the time?
Yes, she was married to Dennis Banks. She met him before Wounded Knee in 1973 when she was 17 years old. They were a couple in Wounded Knee in 73. They have 4 children together, and she lived with him up until 1989. Murphy tried to insinuate and ask her whether she was informant A or B, 2 informants that reported on the movements of the Marlo Brando motorhome. Essentially, she was saying, he was trying to get her to say, look, you were working for the FBI here in the last decade. Were you either informant A or B, insinuating that it was her that was working for the FBI way back then. It basically didn't work. Kamook came across as a credible witness from inside the movement.
And was there any other testimony this morning?
Yes, they brought in Dickie Marshall is how he's known, Richard Marshall. He was acquitted of aiding and abetting first-degree murder this spring in a trial, allegedly for providing the gun. The judge ruled that he would testify today. He indicated, first of all, that he would not incriminate himself and take the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. The state gave him immunity for anything that he would admit to in terms of criminal actions except perjury. And so the judge said he would testify, he would test truthfully. If he was charged with perjury, he would be convicted. He would go back to prison on 3 strikes, you're out, under the Montalou murder case that he confessed to and is now out on parole. So he's had 2 strikes already. He's got 1 strike left. If he's convicted of anything, including contempt of court, he could go back to prison for the rest of his life on a parole violation. He did testify today. He did admit that Theda Nelson Clark came to his house with a girl that she wanted him to stay there. But basically, he pled bad memory about a dozen times this morning. It was a long time ago. I didn't know these people. I never met Annie Mae before. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know who the girl was. But interesting enough, him and his, he said that he attended Annie Mae's wake in February of 1976. So it was an interesting situation where Dick Marshall ended up going to the wake of a woman he had never met before and didn't know, and didn't even, wasn't even sure if it was her at his house.
Did they ask him about the gun?
They asked him directly about the gun. He was declared a hostile witness, and they asked him if he provided the gun. He said no. Did you provide the shells? No. Why did you go back in the bedroom? I didn't go back in the bedroom. Everyone was in the living room. We never went in the back room. I didn't know these people. I didn't do anything. But then, interesting enough, he said, well, my wife, if you want to talk about it, Cleo Gates will remember things much, much better about what happened. And she testified that Dick Marshall, Theda Nelson Clark, Arlo Looking Cloud, John Boy Graham went back into the back room, and that when he came out, he told Cleo, his wife, that they wanted him to keep Annie Mae there and that they wanted to tie her up. He says he has no memory of that whatsoever, but basically vouched for the credibility of his wife and her memory. So they're right now have a mix and match between Cleo Gates's testimony and Dick Marshall's testimony. The question is whether or not it surmounts or is impeachable as a perjury charge is a question. So that's where we are today. We're going to go back this afternoon here shortly. My understanding is that the judge is going to hold a competency hearing for Theda Nelson Clark.
Wow, that's pretty big. She's the one that she's in a nursing home, correct?
She's been in the nursing home from time to time. She's claimed that she has no memory of anything going on, but people have her in the casinos playing. They have her calling up witnesses and threatening witnesses and so forth. And Pearsall in federal court declared her competent earlier this year. They're going to see what we get out of the situation. In line at the particular moment now is Bob Ecafee is due to testify. Mitch Purrier, two people who went to Canada to interview John Boy Patton Graham in the future. There may be Cyril Chapman as a prosecution witness, but it seems like they're getting pretty close on the prosecutional side to rest this case. We'll have to see where it goes.
Well, thank you, Paul, and we'll talk again with you tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Kim.
With Paul, and he's in Rapid City, South Dakota, covering the trial for John Graham. You want to give us the update for today of what happened yesterday afternoon and this morning?
Some of the things that happened yesterday afternoon is that as John Murphy was questioning Kamuk Nichols yesterday, the issue of Ray Robinson came up, and it came up in the context of the American Indian movement eliminating previous informants. And so Ray Robinson's involvement into coming into Wounded Knee and disappearing there was raised. It wasn't raised in depth. The more interesting thing that occurred yesterday afternoon as we returned to the courtroom was that they held a competency hearing for Theda Nelson Clark, who they did bring in by wheelchair, along with her attorney and some affidavits having to do with their medical treatment. Now, she's been reported in the past to be, gambling and able to comprehend major things at times when she wants to. It's questionable. I mean, when this indictment took place in the year 2001 and the trial in 2004 of Arlo Looking Cloud, Theda Nelson Clark might have been much more capable, but it was obvious that her physical capabilities have certainly diminished. She's apparently had some strokes and struggled it. However, the judge had a good conversation with her, and they discussed when she graduated from high school and what school she went to, and details of many things. In fact, corrected him at some times about some of the things he was saying. He ruled her competent, and at that particular point when Marty Jackley, I believe, was describing to her about whether she intended to testify truthfully to the next series of questions, she basically looked to her attorney and asked him, well, what am I supposed to tell this guy? And the attorney at that particular point entered a plea of the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. Now, this took place outside of the purview of the jury, but it was there for both all the people in the audience and the writers and journalists to see. So she was certified as competent. She pled the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, and she was wheeled back out of the courtroom.
Can we go back for a moment, and can you tell everyone who Ray Robinson was?
Ray Robinson was a black civil rights worker who worked with Martin Luther King and Andrew Young and many of that group in the 1960s in the Deep South. In 1973, he went to Wounded Knee in order to support them and to consult with them. He apparently got in several arguments. He was assigned to a bunker. They tried to get him to shoot a gun at marshals during a firefight. He refused to pick up the gun. He was identified or fingered as a potential informant. He was shot in a confrontation that involved David Hill, Dennis Banks, Carter Camp, and Leonard Crow Dog, and some of the other AIM security members there, and was apparently then later passed away or died. He was never seen again. The information we have is that he was laid out in front of Dennis Banks's house at Wounded Knee, the house that Dennis Banks was staying in before Floyd Westerman's younger brother, Quis Westerman, and some other AIM people took him out and buried him. So his remains are apparently still out at Wounded Knee as we speak.
And then Arlo Looking Cloud took the stand yesterday and continued today?
Arlo Looking Cloud took the stand. Of course, his answers are very short and contrite in most of it, yes and no, in terms of the prosecution side. On the defense side, Murphy hammered away at him about the discrepancies in the many statements he's made over the years. There's a dozen documents, some of them a half foot high in terms of testimony and recordings and what he said. And so Murphy basically pointed out that Arlo Looking Cloud has a lengthy criminal record, that he knows how to swing deals, that he's lied to police officers, and that many of these statements are consistent with being inconsistent. This morning, when we resumed, Murphy finished up with that same line. Basically, Arlo is a very agreeable person, agreed to a lot of the things that Murphy said. In fact, the government was unpleased with your story, so when you started telling him this, the government was pleased with what you were telling him, and Arlo would answer, yes. What's interesting is that when the prosecution came back on reexamination, essentially they talked about a certain number of things, and that was that who did you tell the prosecutor? This law enforcement official was at Wambley when Annie Mae was shot, and it was John Graham. And in this document, in this affidavit, so they were able to show that over the years, despite changes in the 72-hour scenario, that Arlo has been consistent in saying that John Graham was present when Annie Mae was shot, and he's been consistent in saying that John Graham shot Annie Mae. Now, there's all kinds of other edges to what he has said over the years, but there is some very intentional and very striking consistency to what he said about John Graham's involvement in it. And I think the prosecution is attempting to show that John Graham was there, that Arlo's been consistent over the years saying that John Graham was there and shot Annie Mae, but there's a lot of other things that have changed over time based on his memory and other things. He didn't speak English until he was 7 or 8 years old. He's not a good reader. He's not real articulate. He's not a public person, so it's been a little bit difficult on the stand, and you can see that. The jury will have to decide whether he's credible at this point, or is at least credible in those particular points the prosecution pointed out, or that he's simply a liar looking for a deal.
But he's currently serving life for his involvement in the Aquash murder. So is there any deal he can even get?
Well, there's no deal that's been offered up. Essentially, if he testifies, there's a couple things. Number one, he's got parole under a 1975 murder in the federal court system. You're eligible for parole after 10 years. He's coming up for parole in another couple of years. There's something called, I think, an I-35 format in which you can go back in front of a judge and ask for reduction. But essentially, he signed a document offering further evidence in here before he ever talked to any prosecutors. He basically discussed some things with his attorney. It was a South Dakota attorney at the time. The attorney approached the U.S. government and says, I think my client has some additional information. He signed a document, says there's no deal being offered whatsoever at this particular point. They're going to have to see what he does. If he cooperates, they perhaps could write a letter that's positive to him, either for a sentence reduction or a parole. But essentially, there is no deal until they see exactly what happens in these cases.
And then Denise, Annie Mae's daughter, she testified today?
Yes, following Arlo Looking Cloud, Denise testified that Arlo Looking Cloud had called him in the year, I believe, 2001, prior to his indictment. I don't have the date. I'm looking for the date right here now. But essentially, she said that Arlo did call Debbie and Denise. They asked about whether they could record him. He said he preferred not to, and they respected that. They said that time stood still for the first time in 30-some years, and that Arlo had said he was calling them because he thought that they deserved to know what had happened to their mother, that he became emotional during parts of the phone call, but that he was consistent in what he's been saying now in regards to, because he didn't talk a lot about all the things in Denver, Colorado and Rapid City, South Dakota. Essentially, he says, we took her to Wambley. John Graham and Theda Nelson Clark walked her out of the car. He got out of the car and stood by the car. They took her over the hill. He heard a gunshot, and they came back, and Annie Mae was not with them any longer. And consistent about the fact that his claim that it was John Graham, in this case, it could be John Graham or Theda at that site, but John Graham is with Theda, one or the other, that he wasn't with them. He has testified previously and in the day during his testimony that he actually observed John Graham seeing him shoot their mother. So again, some inconsistencies in what he said, but consistent in the fact that he places John Graham and Theda and himself at the place where she was executed. And Denise noted that John Graham didn't ever call them. He claims to be their mother's friend, and neither did any other member of the American Indian movement in 35 years contact Debbie or Denise or their family. That Arlo was the only one that ever called, and that he did show remorse for what he was telling her, and said that he didn't know. He says he didn't know. He thought they were just going to scare her. He just said he didn't think that they were actually going to follow through and execute her.
And did he say anything about the gun, being that Dick Marshall has denied that he gave them the gun?
Dick Marshall has denied that he even went back in the bedroom, even though Cleo Gates testified that Dick Marshall, her ex-husband, and Arlo Looking Cloud and John Graham and Theda Nelson Clark all went in the back bedroom. I know federal authorities are going to look at that very deeply to see the inconsistency, because Marshall verified or certified that his ex-wife was a much better witness and had a better recollection of what happened. But basically, Arlo Looking Cloud says that it was Dick Marshall that provided the gun when they went back in that bedroom, that he got the shells and the gun out of a dresser drawer and provided them to Theda Nelson Clark. So, yes, he did.
Okay. And was there anything else that Denise had to testify on today?
It wasn't very lengthy testimony, no. It was basically on that phone call that was in the year 2001. From what I got, Arlo's call was actually in the year 2002, but remember that was 2 years before he was, it was before he was indicted, it was before he was on trial, it was before he was trying to make a deal. He's actually showing remorse and confessing to people about his involvement. And then, like I says, Denise says basically he was the only one from the American Indian movement that had ever contacted the family about this, despite the fact that many Indian people claimed to be close friends of Annie Mae Pictou Aquash and their mother. Following up on the end today real quickly is Robert Ecafee is now on the stand. He's talking about a trip he took to Whitehorse, Canada, and Yukon Territory in 1994 of April, in which he met with John Graham, and during their first encounter that John Graham started shaking so badly that he was trying to light a cigarette, and he was shaking like this and couldn't light the cigarette. They lined up a meeting that afternoon, which he didn't show up to, but later that evening they got together, and Graham did show up at a park. And we're at that point right now where Robert Ecafee is describing his meeting and discussion with John Boy Patton Graham in Yukon Territory, Vancouver, on April 20th, 1994.
And can you tell us a little bit about the who's on the jury before we go for the day?
We've got 7 women on this jury. It's an older jury than the Marshall trial. And at this particular point, there is one African American on it, and I've been told that they thought there were 2 enrolled tribal members on that jury as well. Remember, there's 14 of them. They've got 2 extra just in case someone gets sick or has to drop out for some reason. They're attentive. They're writing notes. They've got a lot to take in. But it's a diverse jury.
And how much longer do you think the trial is going to go on?
I think the prosecution might be able to rest this afternoon if they can get through all the motions and objections. Again, they've dealt with a lot of technicalities. There was technicalities in Canada for extraditing Graham. There's been almost 6 years of litigation and technicalities in terms of motions and all kinds of jurisdictional issues, and now the same thing in court. Lots of objections, lots of technicalities that are being thrown up in the way of some of the evidence and testimony that the prosecution is trying to submit.
Well, thank you, Paul, and we'll catch up with you again tomorrow. Hi, Paul. You want to give us an update on what's happening with the John Graham trial in Rapid City?
Well, when we left you yesterday at noon, Robert Eckefe was on the stand. They brought Robert Eckefe back on the stand to talk a little bit more about a trip that he made that is on April 20th, 1994 is when they made that trip to the Yukon to talk to John Graham. At that time, he sat down with them later on that evening after missing an arrangement to meet Eckefe and Purrier at a local hotel. His then wife, Viola Papakwash, came to the hotel and said that John Graham really didn't want to talk to him, but then allowed them to call Graham, where Bob Eckefe said that, basically said, look, I would appreciate it if you'd spend some time, just hear us out. We have no authority to arrest you here in Canada. We're not threatening you, just hear us out. So they met at Rotary Park in the Whitehorse to meet with Graham, and he sat down at a picnic table with Bob Eckefe next to him and Mitch Purrier across from them, and they talked about the witnesses that they had interviewed in Denver, Colorado, which included Troy Lynn, Yellowwood, Angie Begay, Al Gates, a medicine man that John Graham had contact with and had asked for some help at one point in 1976 because he told Al Gates that he had done something horrible to a woman. And so they laid this evidentiary material that they had, narratives, and basically wanted to know if Graham had a response. They told him they couldn't arrest him, that he had a right to remain silent several times. And they said essentially that Graham began shaking so hard that the picnic table began to rock back and forth. And they thought that they had him. They showed him some pictures of Annie Mae, and he basically looked away, and they said that his eyes welled up. It looked like he was going to cry. And so they felt that they saw significant reactions to Graham that are consistent with some kind of guilt in this whole 72-hour ordeal. They also noted that Graham never once during the interview time was being presented some 45 minutes of dialogue and interviews that these officers had gathered up in the United States, that he never disagreed with anything. He never says, well, they're framing me, that's not true, and those kinds of things. However, at the end, they simply said, did you shoot Annie Mae? And he said, no. And they left it at that. But the intent of this testimony was basically to show that Graham had an opportunity to defend himself. What's more significant to that, he basically said, look, it looks like you guys have my life planned out for me. You have your case against me. And at the end of very end of the interview, he looked out across Whitehorse, and according to Robert Eckefe, basically said, look, I think it's time, something to the substance. It's looked like I'm ready to leave this place anyway and spend the rest of my life in jail. So they had no authority to arrest him at that particular point. They didn't have an arrest warrant. There hadn't been indictments or warrants or anything like that listed, and so they came back to the United States and filed those reports. Both Robert Aquash testified to that, and then Mitch Puryear. Aquash was a U.S. Marshal at the time. Puryear was with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He came on and basically substantiated what Robert Aquash had said about those particular interviews as well. The defense made hay of the fact that they didn't have a tape recorder of any kind, and both investigators basically said, look, we typically don't put a recorder down in front of someone because they don't talk. They don't say anything. They refuse to discuss things, and we wanted to see his reactions and see what happened without those tape recorders. At that particular point, the prosecution rested about 4:30 last evening without calling any other witnesses. The big surprise was reconvening this morning. On the deck to testify this morning was supposed to be one of John Graham's daughters or sons who was going to testify about his character. They had called David Price, a former FBI agent, and the former case worker for the Aquash case, which was Al Gerber with the FBI, and Leonard Peltier's, at that point, 15, 16-year-old girlfriend in 1975, Jean Day. Those were the four witnesses that were left as of yesterday afternoon. This morning we found out that Al Gerber had been released, and that David Price was then released. Jean Day showed up and apparently was released just before they convened the session. John Murphy, the defense attorney for John Graham, stood up and says, Your Honor, the defense rests its case. Basically, their contention is that the state did not prove the charges against their client. That is, rape in the perpetration of murder, kidnapping in the perpetration of murder, or first-degree premeditated murder. He faces 3 different levels of charges. The judge yesterday refused to dismiss any of those charges against John Graham, even though the judge said he thought that perhaps the premeditated charge would be harder to substantiate. He came back this morning and says, I've reviewed everything in my rulings, and I stand by my ruling yesterday was to deny the motion for acquittal. That's where we stand. Jury rules and regulations and instructions are being put together this afternoon. Tomorrow morning on Thursday, December 9th, there are the final closing arguments by first the prosecution, then the defense, and the prosecution finishes it up, and it goes to the jury for its decision. That's where the technical things stop today. A lot of people gasped this morning, including supporters of John Graham. They did not know the defense was going to rest without presenting an alibi. The alibi seems to be consistently Murphy attempted to elicit from different people whether or not certain places were safe houses. John Graham has said that Annie Mae wanted to go willingly from Denver, Colorado to Pine Ridge Reservation. He dropped her off at a safe house. He dropped her off at a safe house. He dropped her off at a safe house. Unfortunately, after 35 years, he's not produced one witness or a location for that safe house. We thought we were going to hear something about that today. There was no defense. There was no alibi. That's a defense strategy. We'll have to see what the jury thinks.
What about all the higher people named? None of them were there?
Nobody was here. We hear that Russell Means fled to Australia until the trial's over.
And where was Dennis and Clyde?
Have no idea. There was no AIM leadership here. A couple family members for John Graham from Canada were down. There was no demonstrations, visible AIM support. There was a few people there that were definitely members of the American Indian movement. But frankly speaking, John Graham is pretty much by himself right at the moment. He's got a few family members with him here in Rapid City, South Dakota.
And in regards to the 3 different things he's charged for, does he have to be like found guilty on all of them, or can he be found guilty on one?
He can be found guilty on any one of the 3. And my suspicion, my prediction is that if there's going to be a verdict of guilt, it'll come back on the aiding and abetting charge, which is kidnapping in the perpetration of murder, rather than the premeditated or the rape allegation.
Okay, well, and tomorrow they do the closing statements?
Yes, and the jury goes out. Maybe by late in the day we'll have a verdict. We don't know. They may be out for a week. We'll have to wait around and see what the jury of 12 decides. Find out what they thought about the credibility of the material.
And Annie Mae Aquash's daughter's there. She wanted to talk with her for a few minutes?
Sure, we'll put her on for a minute. Thanks, Kim.
Hi, Denise. I want to thank you for joining us, and just wanted to get your reaction to the prosecuting resting its case yesterday and the defense resting its case today without calling a witness.
Obviously it was a surprise this morning for us to have that happen without any defense witnesses going and taking the stand in any way trying to contest any of the information that the prosecution has presented throughout this case. This is the third time for us listening to a lot of the testimony, so really wasn't anything new that we've heard. Certainly has given us a sense and a confidence level that enough of the truth has been put out there to indicate that without a doubt these individuals were involved in my mother's murder. And, for us that is all that we had hoped was to get that information out there so that people could hear the truth and hopefully instill some positive thoughts and hopes that people can step forward and speak their truth without being in any way threatened, in any way penalized, and have maybe a little bit of faith put back into the justice system.
And is there anything else you want to share with us in regards to this whole ordeal that you've gone through?
Well, it's been a long battle for our family, 34 years of listening to people tell lies and point fingers. Our family has known for a long time that these people are involved in her murder. It was a matter of finding the people that had the courage to step up and speak their truth and to stand their ground and speak about taboo issues like violence against women and violence within our communities that seems to be something that people are not willing to point fingers at family members and community members, and I think my mother's case sends a very loud message to our communities and those people that have that mindset that under no circumstances does the protection of the brotherhood ever out-trump the murder of a human being, and in this case one of their own, and a woman. So that sends a very loud message, I think, out into Indian country for people to understand that this case had very many levels, very many opportunities for people to step forward and speak their piece. Those involved in my mother's murder chose to protect the brotherhood. They lied. They've known for many years what happened to my mother. We listened to testimony of all these witnesses over the last week and a half. People sit up on the stand and say that they were my mother's friends and that, they were trying to protect the movement, and yet, in our eyes, the message that they sent to us is that our mother's life had no value when it was compared to the protection of the brotherhood.
And the only one that tried to even call you was Arlo Looking Cloud.
That's correct.
And you tried to reach out to Leonard, didn't you?
We had an opportunity to correspond with him in 1999. I received a letter. It was 1999, 2000. I received a letter just after the indictment started getting handed out that Leonard wanted to warn us that, we had to be careful not to become pawns in the FBI's conspiracy to bring down AIM and to keep him incarcerated at the time, not knowing his involvement, and that he, having suspicions that he had in some way had knowledge. We asked him specifically if he had any opportunity to help us or any way that he knew that he could give us information and who murdered her mother, that we would appreciate that. And we received another letter back stating that he would not participate in incarcerating another Indian man.
Wow. And
then shortly thereafter, I think it was a few years later, that he and his organization, the LPDC or whatever it's called, started supporting John Graham.
And do they still support him?
Apparently so. There's all kinds of logos on their websites. I don't visit them very often, but that is the last I heard. They seem to be supporting each other. Just one mention, in 34 years, I know one of the things that John Graham's lawyer has stated throughout this trial is that he tried to say that John was my mother's friend. And in 34 years, he never contacted our family. The only person that ever had contact with us in 34 years from within that group that had knowledge and involvement in my mother's murder was Arlo Looking Cloud.
Well, thank you for taking some time to talk with us today, and I wish you the best of luck with everything. And
Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you. We're here with Paul DeMain, who's in Rapid City, South Dakota, and we're going to talk about the closing statements for the John Graham trial. Do you want to give us an update on that?
Closing statements did take place this morning in Rapid City, South Dakota, in the trial against John Boy Patton Graham in the murder of Annie Mae Pictou Aquash. Of course, yesterday the defense rested without calling any witnesses. They had, my understanding, a couple of hours of haggling over jury instructions, and when you go through all this stuff, you get to the point where you begin almost to understand some of the legalese that's going around there, because it has been a case of technicalities, even though the defense attorney, John Murphy, says this isn't a trial about technicalities. It has been. It's been waiting to be tried for almost 8 or 9 years now, since the indictments took place and the extradition took place and the transfer of jurisdiction from the federal government to the state government for John Graham. The trial is over with. The evidence presented against him is now being judged by the jury. This morning, the prosecution opened up with their beginning statements. They always get the last call. They each had about an hour and 10 minutes apiece. So the prosecution took 40 minutes of that for their opening statement, in which they outlined the case, underlined what aiding and abetting means and the elements of aiding and abetting that had to be proven and why, jurisdictional issues about the fact that this crime came through Pennington County, South Dakota, even though it started in Denver, Colorado, and ended up in Bennett County or Jackson County on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Jurisdiction is conveyed upon any county in which the crime took place in, even if it was over multiple jurisdictions. That making that clear to the jury had to do with a lot of the sequence of events. And so the prosecution pointed out the number of people who testified in Denver, Colorado about Annie Mae being picked up and being kidnapped in Denver, Colorado. The fact that John Graham was there, that he was placed in the car all the way to Rapid City, South Dakota, that she was interrogated at the Wickledock offices of Attorney Bruce Ellison here in Rapid City, South Dakota, by Madonna Gilbert and Lorelei Dakota, relatives of Russell Means, that she was then taken to Thelma Rios' house. Thelma Rios has pled guilty to the kidnapping charge already previously. She was then taken to Bill Means' house on the Rosebud Reservation, then to Dick Marshall's on the Pine Ridge Reservation, where they refused to keep her there, or to tie her up, or to put her in the basement, where allegedly the gun and the bullets were provided. And basically the prosecution says to the jury, you saw the demeanor of Mr. Marshall. It's up to you to decide whether or not he was lying. It's interesting that he had a demeanor in which it was very defiant, in which he lost his memory at certain key moments on the witness stand. He couldn't remember anything. But I think they've placed John Graham, Theda Nelson Clark, and Arlo Looking Cloud there, based not only on Arlo Looking Cloud's testimony, but the testimony of Cleo Gates and Dick Marshall in part, and there to Wombly, where she was executed, and the narratives that Arlo has made over the years always contain John Graham. The element by the prosecution attorneys that the jury needs to judge us by is the fact that John Graham does not have to be shown to be the trigger person in this case. As long as he aided and abetted the kidnapping, which ended up in murder, they can find him guilty. And those kinds of jury instructions are in depth. They went through the case. Murphy came back as an alibi, basically said that it was, the prosecution almost did things that might have could have created a situation in which they could lose their bar license. That is that they put a bunch of liars up here, a bunch of people who made things up, that it was a disgrace that they brought someone in like John Graham, that they would bring in a FBI employee like Kamuk Ekafy, and he called her an FBI employee who was making a living off of taking money from the FBI to create their stories and everything. So he pretty much he went after everybody on the prosecution side, whether you were working with the prosecution willingly or reluctantly, or whether you were the hardest aimed core radical there was. Murphy went over everyone and said this was a big conspiracy, that the murder took place at a time when his client wasn't there. He said that John Graham probably took Annie Mae from Denver, Colorado to Pine Ridge Reservation right after Thanksgiving, and that the ride that everyone's talking about didn't have anything to do with his client, that his client wasn't there, and he proposed that Annie Mae was even alive up in February 1976 and might have been a victim of some kind of a hit-and-run accident that was reported by Irene Blackrow. I don't think it's believable to most of the people that were sitting in the audience. And basically, the prosecution pointed out, and just like a lot of other people said, in order to do this, I mean, he said, look, it's a shameful act that the prosecution ever brought Arlo Looking Cloud in to create this great conspiracy to convict an innocent man. And considering that he called Arlo Looking Cloud an alcoholic and a drug addict and a prolific liar and someone who knows how to manipulate the city, the prosecution pointed out that you would have to say that the whole prosecutional system took a guy that they knew would lie, could be manipulative and everything else, and would discredit himself, and built a conspiracy with another 30 witnesses around it, and that Arlo Looking Cloud is the key witness. And it just wasn't the case. He was the person that was there. Arlo's had a rough life. He's tried to diminish his role in this thing from the beginning to the end for 35 years. He was scared and fearful about the knowledge he had, and he has difficulty on the stand in a public forum. He's not a public speaker. But Arlo was omitted as an accomplice of John Graham as a key evidentiary person, and so the prosecution had to point out all the different places where witnesses corroborated what Arlo Looking Cloud was saying, and I think they did that. I think the feeling today is that there's a good chance that there will be certainly amongst all the people with the Aquash family and everything, that there's going to be a finding of guilt on the jury side for one charge or the other. Remember, he's got a premeditated murder charge and an aiding and abetting murder charge up there, and the jury can find him guilty of it by finding that he participated in either the kidnapping or the premeditated murder. On the other hand, on the defense side, there's some members of John Graham's family that was here. Jean Day, one of the spokesmen for the Leonard Peltier Defense Committee, was here to testify. She was not called for the defense yesterday. She was here. She was with John Graham and their family. And it's interesting that I think they are hopeful about it, but John Graham's significant other from Vancouver, British Columbia, had to get up in the middle of the processes and leave the courtroom for a while. It seemed to be emotionally upsetting her what was being said, and she's the only person that got up and left this morning. So, but I'm sure they're hopeful. I think they believe that their attorney rested the case without any calling in a witness, because his judgment was that the state had not proved the case. It's before the jury now, and the evidentiary stuff is there.
And now we just have to wait.
We'll have to wait. They could be back. Everyone's on pins and needles right now, probably on both sides. Everyone, when the jury went out, everyone broke for lunch. In the Marshall case, they came back within 3 hours and acquitted Dick Marshall. At this point, we're at the 3-hour line there. So it's going longer than that. Arlo Looking Cloud's case, the jury was out probably about 6 hours before they came back with a verdict of guilty. Everyone's anticipating that we'll at least be here until late in the day. The jury has the option of going late into the night or coming back tomorrow and deliberating. There's several people who are saying that they're not planning to leave until next week, just in case the jury goes into a long time deliberation. So far, we haven't heard that they've asked any questions back to the judge or the attorneys for some guidance. So they're in there deliberating the credibility of the evidence, and we'll have to see what the outcome of 12 citizens and peers of John Graham have to say.
Well, thank you, Paul. Appreciate you following this.
Thank you, Kim.
understand that you are now an educator known as Dr. Aquash, but 35 years ago, you were with and around your auntie Annie Mae Aquash and the American Indian movement. And now that you have spent the last 1 or 2 days listening to the closing arguments, what is your observation with everything you've seen?
Well, just want to say bonjour and greetings to everyone listening. I just wanted to indicate that, this has been a real eye-opening experience for me. I grew up in the American Indian movement and have, I believe, the same lies that everybody else has. And over these years, during the investigation and the subsequent trials, a lot of information has emerged, and I've really it's really opened my eyes to see the truth that has been in the shadows for so long. And I believe a lot of people are starting to see that truth as well. I read it. I read it in the articles. I see people writing about the information that is being generated and coming out. People aren't afraid to talk about the truth anymore. So I also believe these lies that were that probably have been out there far too long, and it's been not much of a healing experience, but more of a painful experience. Where first I denied it, and said, they got to be lying. The people that are telling the truth have to be lying. So it was real difficult, and now that I've seen exactly what took place back 35 years ago, it really makes a lot of sense. And I'm getting over the anger and the pain, but it also is a process of closure as well, and seeking justice. I had a real good relationship with my aunt as well as my uncle, and they made a major impact on my life. And if I hadn't traveled with them back in the early 70s, I probably wouldn't be where I'm at today, and being successful and with my education. So I really find myself fortunate, but also I miss them, and I miss many of the people that were the true leaders of the American Indian movement back in those days. And I certainly miss Annie Mae.
Who were the true leaders in your eyes?
There were a lot of women that were that had the smarts to put in funding proposals and writing developing different kinds of policies and things like that, and programs, and those things are still around today. So the processes of culturally based education, those were the kind of things that Annie Mae, she really fought for that, and today we take that for granted. And I think many of our communities are fortunate to have these kinds of programs available for our young people, because it has made a major impact on our young people, especially in processes of decolonization, where we're able to take out some of the Eurocentric kinds of information within our communities and replace it with our own indigenous or our First Nations or American Indian tribal kinds of practices, so that we can have a sense of our own identity rather than having somebody else's history. We have our own history. So.
And is there anything else you'd like to share with us, or could you tell us a little bit about your experience with hanging out with your auntie?
Well, I just wanted to let everybody know that I feel that same pain and that feeling of loss when the truth is revealed. That it's hard, it's difficult to accept, and one of the things that really comes to my mind is. I learned how to pray, and I learned how to burn smudge, and that's one of the things that my auntie taught me, and that was one of the first things that I can remember when I look back during those days that she was burning smudge, and I asked her what she was doing, and she explained it to me, and so that's one of the personal memories that I have of her specifically, and that's something that I practice today, and especially in her memory.
Well, thank you for joining me, and I wish you everyone the best of luck out there with the verdict that comes back. Thank you.
Thank you. Dziękuję.
Jurors needed only about 4 hours to agree that John Graham and 2 other American Indian Movement supporters kidnapped a fellow activist in 1975 and killed her on the Pine Ridge Reservation of South Dakota, one jury member said. But they weren't all convinced it was Graham who pulled the trigger. After a second day of deliberations on December 10th, the 12 jurors convicted John Graham of felony murder during the kidnapping of Annie Mae Pictou Aquash, whose death came to symbolize the American Indian Movement and its often violent struggles with federal agents during the 1970s, but acquitted him of premeditated murder. Juror Barry Winter said that although he and 11 others came to a swift agreement Graham was culpable in Aquash's death, there was disagreement about his role. Arlo Looking Cloud, who was convicted in Aquash's slaying 6 years ago and is serving a life sentence, was the only witness who testified of seeing Graham kill Aquash. Looking Cloud said he stood nearby as it happened. The jury eventually decided there wasn't enough evidence to convict Graham, a 55-year-old Southern Shoshone Indian from Canada, of premeditation, Winter said. On the first count, we came to a fairly short resolution that he was guilty, Winter told the Associated Press. On the second one, that's what we spent a lot of time on. Lead prosecutor Marty Jackley, the state's attorney general, said the felony murder charge carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. Jackley said that last Friday he wasn't sure whether parole was even an option. Prosecutors said the activist who kidnapped and killed Aquash believed she was a government spy, which authorities have denied. As South Dakota Judge John Delaney read the verdict December 13th, as he read the verdict on December 10th, Graham gazed straight ahead without moving. His daughter, Naanique Graham, began to weep as jurors stood one by one to affirm the verdicts. The defense called no witnesses during the trial. Instead, John Murphy, his attorney, questioned several prosecution witnesses, particularly Looking Cloud, about conflicts between their testimony and previous statements. And now we go to a brief interview conducted by the Aboriginal Public Television Network from Winnipeg, Canada, where the questions will be written for each answer for you to see.
News from Indian Country, or myself mainly, was part of a journalistic team that began reviewing the cases of Annie Mae Pictou Aquash and Leonard Peltier in 1994, when members of the leadership of the American Indian Movement, Vernon, Clyde, Bellcourt, Dennis Banks, challenged Native journalists to review these cases and the alleged killings of other members of the American Indian Movement at Pine Ridge, South Dakota during the 70s. And so we assembled a team of about a dozen people within 2 or 3 years of reviewing the case files. There was 4 or 5 of us left, and near the end, probably at the end of the decade, turn of the century,
there was myself, Minnie Tushumes, a long-term member of the American Indian Movement, and then one of the most premier investigative Native journalists, Richard LaCourse, left reviewing the case as some of the most compelling revelations came to light through looking at the documents. I think it was an accumulation of a lot of things. We were pushing news articles out, asking lots of questions, reviewing documents, discovering liars, discovering evidence around the same time that Robert Ekefee became a U.S. Marshal, which actually provided access to some tools on the investigative end. And I think the era of fear, members of the American Indian Movement have been growing up, maturing, growing older. They got children and grandchildren. And I think the conscience speaks to people as they age. And I think people began realizing they needed to get these things off their chests. Many of them came to Native journalists. But I think what I'm most proud of is between the Native journalists that looked over this case and the Native investigators like Bob Ekefee or Mitch Purrier, a Bureau of Indian Affairs law enforcement officer, which was significance in the conviction of John Graham, was that the Native community was involved in trying to bring this case to justice. You could have cut there, you could have dropped a pin and heard it. It was a mixed day in which we were notified, Debbie and Denise. I was with Annie Mae Aquash's daughters when the prosecutors called initially at 4 o'clock and said there was a locked jury. By the time we got to the courthouse at 4:20, they said they had reached a verdict on one count, but they were locked on the other. And by 5 o'clock, when they had resolved the issue about whether they could miss trial on one charge and take the verdict on the other was resolved, the jury had come to a conclusion. What we didn't know that the jury at the time was that the jury had come to a conclusion that John Graham aided and abetted within the 4 hours of deliberation, and that the locking and the deliberations for another day and a half took place over the issue about whether or not he was the trigger man. So they believed the bulk of the evidence. They believed Arlo Looking Cloud, even though he had many stories. They also found that over the course of 35 years, he was consistent about 3 things. John Graham was with them when they tied Annie Mae up in Denver, Colorado. John Graham was with Arlo Looking Cloud when they were in Rapid City, South Dakota, when Annie Mae was interrogated. And John Graham was with them when he alleged that John Graham shot Annie Mae. The jury acquitted John Graham on the premeditated murder or the triggerman charge because some people were unsure of those final moments. But he also, at the time of the sentence, is a life sentence, mandatory life without parole in state court that he's been convicted on. Well, we want to remember that we have 2 convictions, 1 guilty plea and 1 acquittal, and they still put Dick Marshall up there despite being acquittal. I have no doubt that after the prosecutors sit down and see where they are in this case, that the analysis is this. If John Graham had been acquitted, that would have been the end of this investigative case. Now with the guilty plea, they sealed Thelma Rios' testimony. She did not appear as a witness against John Graham in this trial. The question is what did she put in her sealed testimony? And I suspect that the prosecutors are going to analyze that and decide to move forward. And moving forward means they're going to get to the people who couried the messages and gave the order. And that points right to the entire leadership, frankly. It wasn't one individual who gave the order. It was most likely a consensus among the leadership that they had a problem, and they wanted this group of people to deal with that problem and resolve it, and they did. Thank you.